All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Center for AI Research at HKUST, our webinar today. And welcome our guest, Dr. Kai-Fu Lee. Dr. Kai-Fu Lee is the chairman and CEO of Sinovation Ventures. And many of us, and an old friend of HKUST, we have welcomed him to our campus many times before. And Kai-Fu Lee is a very prominent, actually thought leader in AI globally, as well as a very famous investor in AI in China. And previously he was a senior executive. He started Microsoft Research Asia. And I remember this is about more than 20, almost 30 years ago. Very first such research lab in Greater China, in China actually. And then he also started Google Labs, right? And before then, actually, Kai-Fu, welcome to UST virtually again. And thank you for coming to our webinar. So actually, Kai-Fu, I remember very early 90s, it was 1990 or 91. I was working at BBN. And I remember our system was called Biblos, the continuous speech recognition system with 5,000 words, which was considered a large vocabulary. And one day we saw you on Good Morning America, was it? Demonstrating, that was the very first live demo of a speech recognition system, Casper, right? And we thought you were so brave to demo that system live. Can you tell us a bit about the story? How did you, another thing is that I remember your PhD thesis was the beginning of all of this. Can you tell a bit about your story then and leading to today? Okay.
Okay, sure, thanks. It's great to talk to students at UST again. I started my PhD thesis, my PhD work in '83 and studied with Raj Reddy at Carnegie Mellon. And that was during the kind of the first end of the first wave of AI, which was expert systems. And I remember still very vividly that he wanted me to work with the rest of the speech team using rule-based approach. And one day I had to get enough courage to go to him and say, I love you as my advisor, I love speech recognition, but can you let me work on statistical machine learning methods? And we talked about it for a couple of minutes. And in the end, he said, well, Kai-Fu, I don't really agree with you, but I will support you. And that was really important for me, that I could have not only his support and wisdom and generosity, but he gave me 30 machines. You see, those other people working on rule-based systems, they bought all these fancy machines with millions of dollars of DARPA funding. But as you know, expert systems don't really take a lot of computing. So they were all idle every night. During the day, they were running Lisp, so it was at least being used. But in the evening, I took over all 30 machines, and that really was very helpful. And also, Raj convinced National Institute of Standards to collect a huge amount of training data for all of us. But it was at my request because I thought for the work I was doing, it was really needed. And if anybody can guess how much data we got, it was a huge speech database. I remember we had a giant disk, which was 200 pounds. We had to carry it and mount it
200 pounds.
and download it. Yeah, it was very, I didn't have to lift it. We had people who helped with that. But it was only 100 megabytes at that time. And today, you know, you the students at UST are so fortunate to have probably 1 million times more memory. But anyway, with that database, 100 megabytes, 4,200 sentences, I was able to train the first speaker independent continuous speech recognition system. And that was my thesis.
Yeah, speaker independent means you didn't have, it was not customized for one person's voice. And continuous means you can speak continuously. Yeah. It was really a breakthrough, I remember. But tell us a bit about that demo. It was a very first live demo on TV, right? Of a speech recognition system. Usually people, yes, even today, doing live demo is a very brave thing. So was it real? Was it faked? Was there really the machine doing the job, or there was a human behind it?
it had a human behind it, but it was real. So let me tell you what happened. When I went to Apple in 1990, actually a number of us, including a great engineer from BBN, and one from CMU, and we kind of hired a very great speech team, and we made the system not only work, but also run on an ordinary Mac. It's unthinkable because the system we had was probably about 1,000 times real time, and we made it real time. And we did that with all kinds of shortcuts, and came up with ways to quantize speech into very, I guess I can talk about it now, it's already probably expired. We quantized into very small, I think it was 4-bit quantization. Nobody ever would think that would ever work. But we lost some accuracy, but we got it to work. And also we had a DSP. The DSP chip did the signal processing to compute the capstone coefficients. And then the hidden markup models were running on basically a 4-bit discrete model, very tiny models, and it actually worked. So the system did work. What was problematic was that the DSP that we had our hardware lab build a board that we plugged into the Mac, and that board was buggy. So we connected the demo on the one side using the card for hardware processing of signal processing. On the other hand, on the other side, we're connected to a number of Macintosh applications, including HyperCard, Calendar, and so on. So we were actually able to program the Mac by telling it to write a check or program my VCR and schedule a meeting. So it works very much like the way Siri or Alexa works today, except this was 92 or 93, almost 30 years ago.
90.
And the card was either 92 or 93. So John Sculley, who was the CEO of Apple at the time, he was urgently in need of a good demo, a number of good demos, because he was under pressure by the board to sell Apple. So I showed him the demo one day, and he said, "This is great. We're going to tell the whole world." And then he started accepting invitations. And then one day the system crashed, and he said, "Kai-Fu, this is not reliable." And I said, "Well, of course not. This is hardware. We soldered together ourselves." And he said, "Can you make it stable? How unstable is it?" And I said, "Probably a 10% chance of crashing." And he said, "No, we're going on Good Morning America. This is real-time national TV. If you crash, we're in huge trouble." And he said, "If you can make it 99% accurate, reliable, then we can do it. 1% chance I can accept." So I went back, and the next day I said, "John, I did it. It's now 1% risk." But what I didn't tell him was there was no time we change the hardware or recode the machine code on the hardware. So I just took 2 cards because we made 2 cards. So we put them on 2 Macs, and then we had a switcher. So we had a human in the back, and I told him, if the system ever crashed, just switch to the other Mac, because if one machine has a 10% chance of crashing, then both machines crashing would be 1%, right? So that was the trick we had on Good Morning America. And the system worked pretty well, yes. But it was so unbelievable at the time that the host, Joan London, after we did it, she was still flabbergasted, not believing speech recognition actually works. So we walked to the backstage, and then she saw the person there playing with the switcher. And then she turned to her assistant and said, "I knew it was fake." So that was the story. Yeah. But it was a real demo.
Yes, we were all very impressed at BBN watching that. Now, I remember in those days that there were maybe 100 people in our area working on speech recognition. And even up to 10 years ago, I remember like there were investors talking to me, asking me, "Why are you doing this? You know, why do you even do this?" So, and today, you know, AI has evolved from something akin to a rocket science to mainstream applications. And which fields and industries do you
Right.
think are really adopting AI already, and which are yet to come to adopt this in general, not just speech recognition, but AI in general, in your opinion?
Right. I think AI in general. Sure, sure. So in my book, AI Superpowers, I talked about the 4 waves of AI. And the
Right.
first wave was the internet wave. And that's where there is a widespread adoption because, AI works mostly because of a huge amount of data that could be run to optimize an objective function. And when that objective function is connected to a business result, such as increased revenue for Amazon, increased ad click-through for Google, increased number of user minutes for Facebook, then there is a case for applying AI. So the first wave were clearly the internet companies. At this stage, I think about every internet company has used huge amounts of data, which they naturally get. We're essentially guinea pigs for internet companies, helping them collect data, optimize business metrics. That's the first step. Then I think we're going to see the next phase. I think we'll see financial industry, and that includes insurance companies, banking, investments, AI, uh, quantitative funds. These are also similar to the internet company in the sense that the huge amount of data that can be used to train something, which is really a virtual game, right? All financial industries are a human-invented virtual game for which the reward can be optimized in terms of for insurance, it might be minimize the number of claims. For loans, it might be minimize the number of bad loans and defaults. And for investments, it would be maximize returns. So the financial industry will be the next wave. So I think today we're seeing more and more banks and insurance companies and investment companies embrace AI. That's the natural next step. Beyond that, it gets a little tougher because collecting data in, say, healthcare or manufacturing or retail is a little more difficult. And beyond that, when we need to integrate speech, natural language, sensors, computer vision, it's also a little bit tougher even, but applications to come out. Speech is working better. Machine translation, I think, will tip in the next so vision to work pretty well. So we apply to all kinds of industries. For in companies that have virtual teachers that can ask questions. We have virtual recruiters who can conduct a first interview screening for possible employment. So these are beginning to happen. I think what is a little more distant would be robots and autonomous vehicles and true transportation applications. But everything I mentioned will happen in the next 15 years or so. So AI will truly penetrate and disrupt every industry. It will first disrupt the ones that have the most data that's already ready, and then it will go into areas where perception becomes mature. It includes speech, machine translation, and computer vision. Robotics and autonomous vehicle is the hardest, but that will also be conquered in the next 10 to 15 year time frame. So eventually everything.
Yes. Now, I would have loved for you to come to UST today and have a real fireside chat. But, given the situation, we're all stuck, across different borders. So year 2020, this is a very special year. So what do you think the pandemic has, have any, if any, impact on the AI adoption and disruption in the world today, especially in China? Do you think it has made any difference?
I think it accelerates AI, but it also exacerbates inequality and job displacement. But let's first talk about the speeding up. Because people's habits are very difficult to change. It takes 2 to 3 months generally to change a habit on the average. But our habits have now been changed. We are studying online. We're having this lecture online.
Right.
People apply for online. Yeah. and people go to school and work online. And what the implication of that is multifold. First, by doing everything online, everything's digitized. If it's digitized, then AI can potentially be applied to it. And secondly, when the workload is now digitized, some of that workload can be replaced or enhanced by AI. So using RPA technologies to replace people who are doing back office processing or customer service, having virtual teachers and agents and sales reps and customer service would be another way in which AI could be plugged in. To make a full virtual teacher that walks the earth is extremely difficult and probably can't even be done. And if it's ever done, students may not accept it. But having a rendered teacher, yeah, that's right. That'll be job security issue for you, but not to worry. The top teacher will always be safe. And also, physically we can't build it. Robotics is too hard. But having I can have a virtual Kai-Fu give the same lecture and answer questions, probably within 5 years. And when that happens, don't you think?
Yeah, I like that goal. So
yeah, so you can think of it as
my main area of research is conversational AI, right? So that goes
yes.
That's true. That's true. So we could be having this fireside chat between two AI agents, or me with you with a fake me and me with a fake you. You can give all these talks simultaneously everywhere in different topics, right? We don't have the schedule so difficult. Okay, yes, that's a very good goal.
You know, I already do that. I get a lot of invitations to give lectures on Zoom. Yes. Then I just repeat it and I say, well, in order to ensure high quality, we're going to send you a recorded version of talk for you, but it's actually the same talk.
Right.
So you're trickier because you want to do the fireside chat. So this has to be the real me.
Right.
So anyway, coming back to the question, another aspect where the pandemic speeds up adoption of AI is the social distancing and minimizing contacts. So robots are being used, especially in China. When I did my quarantine in Beijing, all my food delivery and packages from Taobao and delivery from they delivered to the receptionist downstairs, who loads it on the robot, who finds its way to my door. The robotic is everywhere. When I go to a number of my favorite restaurants now, the restaurants are now opening in Beijing. Many of them have robotic waiters now. They don't do everything a waiter does, but they're like a tray with multiple layers, and then with wheels that goes to your table. Because as you know, navigation in unknown environments is extremely hard. Navigation in full traffic is extremely hard. Delivery to an apartment in a building or to a table in a restaurant, that's quite easy. So robotics is accelerating. We're also seeing a number of factories and warehouses who were affected by COVID. I think Amazon was an example in the US, and now there's that pushes them to use robotic workforce as early as possible. So that is also being accelerated. So these are some of the ways that I think the pandemic will accelerate digital usage and adoption of AI. There's of course a downside, because when the jobs are being evaluated and taken with AI and automation, there will be people who will be looking for jobs and who will be out of jobs, who may be currently laid off, hoping to come back to work, but they might not find the work to be there. Because another aspect of the pandemic is we haven't yet seen a huge economic downturn. We've seen some of it, but because the stock market is quite good, it's masked a lot of the downside. So when the pandemic is truly over and many people cannot go back to their jobs, I think that will be a serious consequence. Another aspect is a lot of companies in ordinary times may be reluctant to lay off a bunch of people and replace them with AI. But during these tough economic times, people are cash strapped, or competition is tough, or they have to make the ends meet. So there's going to be a greater willingness to replace people with AI, whether it's blue collar or repetitive white collar work. So that's kind of another aspect of the consequence of the pandemic.
So you talked a lot about the, the adverse impact of the pandemic, of AI actually on job replacement and all. Is there anything positive? Do you think it could actually create some new business opportunities, new startup ideas, new jobs perhaps?
Absolutely. So I'm also a believer that AI will ultimately create more jobs than it destroys. Just look at the internet, right? Obviously, the internet took over a bunch of jobs. A lot of people who used to, I bet there are people in media or retail who've lost their jobs because people are buying online or reading online, and that's just the beginning. But it has led to more jobs, and people have studied that, and I think AI will be the same. One big problem, though, is that AI displacement is happening right now. AI creating new jobs will take longer. And it's hard to predict what kind of jobs will be created. For example, if we look at what jobs did the internet create, obviously, if you ask me 25 years ago, what jobs would the internet create? I would give you some examples, but I would miss most of the real ones. And I would say, yeah, website designer, HTML programmer, Java programmers, I would say that. Just like today, you ask me about AI, I would say, well, people who know TensorFlow and who can program GPU and so on, data scientists. But really, if you look at what internet jobs have been created, many of them were unthinkable 25 years ago. Take Uber or DiDi driver as an example. There are probably 20 million of them in the world today. And no one 25 years ago would have predicted that be a job category. So I think the challenge we have is we can't quite project what jobs will come out when in the next 20 years. We can, however, predict what jobs will go away in the next 15 years. And AI is a little bit more challenging because it does have this specific aspect, which is specifically to take care of routine work and replace human routine work. So I think that is a challenge. I think we really owe it to the world to make sure they're aware that this is a likely outcome, and education needs to be revamped so that students know what categories not to get into, right? This is obvious to you and me, perhaps, but not a lot of people say that. For example, if you went to a medical school and asked the students, how many of you want to do this kind of doctor, that kind of doctor, we can probably estimate which jobs are going to be gone. But I'm not sure the medical students know it, because even when I say routine job, some of the tasks within categories of doctors are routine. For example, radiology.
Radiology.
We still need radiologists, but looking for tumors in particular types, that will be phased out over to AI. Similarly, pathologists would be another challenge. On the other hand, psychologists are probably quite safe. So I think we need to let young people know what types of jobs are going to likely be displaced and phased out, so they can plan accordingly. But I think final point I want to make. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I say.
Okay. Final point I want to make it's really not. If we think more at a 20-year horizon, it's really good for humanity. In the next 20 years, there will be a lot of disruption. Some people will lose their jobs and have to change jobs and maybe change again and again because AI keeps getting better and takes over the next job that people have. But if we look back 20 years from now, I think what we'll see is that AI largely are doing routine jobs. So that means people can be elevated beyond doing routine jobs. And after all, who wants to spend all day doing routine jobs anyway? And in 20 years, we should be able to look back and see that we've been liberated from doing routine jobs. so we can do jobs, do things that we really love or that requires humans to do, such as creativity or compassion and human-to-human connections. So I think ultimately it'll be a good thing, but in the short term, there will be some pain.
Well, thank you. So you also have this vision of AI infusion, right? So what do you mean by that, yeah. AI infusion?
Yeah, when we say AI infusion, what we're talking about is to infuse traditional businesses with AI technologies so that they can improve efficiency, reduce costs, and turn over more of their work to be done by AI. So for example, if you were a bank giving out loans, rather than have human loan officers, AI can do that with a lower default rate. If you were a retail chain, you could use AI to estimate what products you need to replenish and order them based on previous people's spending. And if you were a recruiting website, you could use AI to help people connect to jobs that they really want to do, and also help jobs connect to the people who'd be good for it, as well as build these virtual interviewers that I mentioned, who could do a first round screening interview. So almost for every imaginable industry, we can think about how AI can play a role. So the AI infusion means one way or another, getting AI into the hands of traditional industries. I think that's going to be the biggest opportunity for AI in terms of net incremental GDP for the world. Both McKinsey and PwC have estimated that in the next 9 years, AI will add on the order of 15 to 16 trillion dollars to the global incremental GDP. And most of that will be in traditional industries like retail, healthcare, manufacturing, B2B software, outsourcing, etc. And the AI infusion is the process of helping the traditional companies. Now, how does AI get infused into traditional companies? One is that the traditional company can hire AI engineers. Sometimes that's a little bit tough because not all AI engineers want to work for very traditional companies, but I think over time they will. Another way is cloud. Amazon and Alibaba clouds have AI capabilities. That would be the other extreme. But most likely, they will need some handholding. Either consultants or Sinovation actually has a consulting practice in addition to being VCs of going in to help companies with AI technologies. And what we're observing is that only about 5% of all traditional companies use AI, yet a significant percentage of the 95% are ready to adopt AI in the sense that they either have or can gather data in a way that is connected to their business outcome. So if only they got some help, could have 23% increase in earning. So we see this as the largest piece of addition or benefit to the economy. So while I'm all excited about all the cool things we could do with flying cars and fancy robotics, I think that in the next 5 years, the greatest amount of money will be made by infusing AI into traditional companies, because there is an asymmetrical information that we know how to help them do something that they themselves may not know how to do. So if we, the AI people and the AI product people, can work with the traditional industries to find the ones where there's a low-hanging fruit, I think there is a lot of businesses that will be updated, a lot of benefits to the economy, and a lot of money to be made if we're clever about cherry-picking the right companies in which to infuse AI.
Yeah, so you mentioned recently, I think, that this is no longer, today's market is no longer enough to be at the forefront of AI research. to succeed as an AI company, you really have to look for the business opportunities. So do you have any words of advice for our students who might be potentially thinking of doing startups? What kind of qualification they need to have? What kind of things they should be looking out for? What kind of, what kind of experience they need to maximize, to optimize the chance of success with their startup, AI startup?
Okay. The first thing to be aware of is that the opportunities that people who are 5 to 10 years ahead of you got are really largely no longer available. So I really would suggest people not to say, oh, there's the, DJI and SenseTime and MegaV, and all these companies were started by AI people, and they became billions of dollars valuations in a very short amount of time. Therefore, I want to do that. Now, I understand the power of a role model can be very, very powerful. But the thing is, AI is no longer in that phase of development where having 10 super PhDs in AI necessarily creates a company with great value that can snowball into a unicorn, into billions of dollars of value. Because AI technologies are getting easier and easier to deploy. I mean, you guys are doing it every day, right? Probably in your AI class in 2 or 3 weeks, you were already training TensorFlow. And that just wasn't possible 5 years ago. So knowing how to use AI 5 years ago was a huge advantage. And that was the right place at the right time. And that just isn't true today. So don't have, you need to let go of any belief that just because such and such professor or PhD did this and the company's worth $1 billion today, I'm going to achieve the same. That's just not always the case. It's still a good thing you're in AI relative to other technologies. It's still one of the most desirable areas, but just not that easy. So if you still want to start a company, I would make 3 suggestions. First is really consider the time you graduate. Don't start a company just immediately. Think about joining a startup and learning from that startup. And you will be ready to start your own startup. For the great majority of people, that is much preferable because when you just graduate, you don't yet know what you don't know. And there's a high risk of falling into the trap of thinking that you know how to build a company. But think about whether you have managed people, were able to motivate people, raise money, and understand product market fit. These are all things that take time to learn. And the best place to learn this is at a startup. So join a startup, learn 2 or 3 years. That's the first advice. But if you still want to start your company, either after that or without that, I think there are, I have two other suggestions. One is that if you truly have some technology that is way ahead of the competition, that even Google and Facebook don't have, that you can do something they cannot do, and they can easily catch up or copy you within, let's say, an 18-month window. If you have that kind of a technology, then go for it. I'm not saying there would be no more rocket science companies. Of course, there will be rocket science companies. There always has been for the last 30 years. It's just that between the last 3 years ago and maybe 5 years ago, that was a golden period where there were more than usual number of rocket science companies. Now we're kind of back to usual. So if you have that kind of an idea, whether it's in robotics or something very advanced, or an amazing application, by all means do it, but make sure you have that advantage, because nowadays when people publish, other people read it and implement it quickly. So you've got to make sure that you're able to keep that advantage if you still want to do a rocket science startup. The third and last suggestion I have is don't just think about a rocket science technology. If you're just really good in AI, and now is a good time to network and to get to know people who complement your skills. Because if you believe what I said about we're now making AI work, the biggest opportunity is AI infusion into traditional companies, well, then your opportunity is either to build a product that you can sell to traditional companies, or go work with someone from the traditional industry who can teach you about the business, who know how to sell, while you know how to build the technologies. So that kind of complementarity is really important. And also keep in mind, if you do find a great entrepreneur who has sales and business experience in a particular industry, let's say it's drug discovery, or it's selling SaaS software to retail or something like that, well, you have to also understand and accept that they're the CEO, you're the CTO. And that's an important thing to accept, because the days of PhDs starting companies that are business oriented and acting as a CEO is just not desirable, because they don't have, or you don't have the right skill sets in business, and given it's a business focused company. And also when you're selling something to enterprises, to industries, the CEO is the top salesperson, and you probably don't want to, all the technologies you learned and the great technologies that you've become, you don't want to spend your day becoming a salesperson. So that's something to think about, the combination. Increasingly, if you look at the companies we fund, the business-oriented AI companies are generally led by a business CEO, complemented with a technology CTO. Now, for the rocket science companies, it's perfectly fine for the technologist to be the CEO. It's important to separate these two types of possible AI companies.
So if there's today Kai-Fu Lee finishing his PhD thesis at CMU, would you recommend that he becomes the CEO or the CTO?
Well, at the time I finished my thesis, I think speech was a rocket science technology, and it was not a product that requires an industry CEO to go sell. So I probably could have started a company as a CEO, but as things work out, that company probably would be out of business, because another important aspect is to pick the right timing, right? You have to start the speech recognition company at just the right time, so when the technology matures and beats people in performance, that's the moment you got to have your product ready. If you do it 5 years too early, you'll have no sales and you'll be gone. If you do it 5 years late, someone else will capture the opportunity. So that Kai-Fu Lee in 1988 would have probably got funding and became a CEO, and in 3 or 4 years, probably out of business and trying to get a job at Apple. Or maybe
your company would have been bought by Apple.
Also possible. Yeah, it's interesting to watch at the time when you and I were working on speech,
right,
which companies survived, right? There were a lot of speech companies.
Right.
So eventually in the US, one survived, Nuance.
Yeah.
But they still kind of missed the spot because they caught telephony. Right? They built great products for telephony, but the big application now appears to be, you got to be an internet company to collect all the data. Yeah. So now the best performing speech are by Amazon and Google, and Nuance is still okay. And interestingly, there was a company in China, iFlyTech, they started way too early. They actually started the same year. Yeah, you know them probably. This in 1998. Yeah. Yeah, the same year I started Microsoft Research, because I tried to recruit Fung, the CEO, to join us.
Right.
I told him, you're way too early. This isn't going to work. And he said, no, I got to do it. And it turns out, I think we're both right. I was right that he was too early, that such a startup in the US would have starved. But he was able to get a lot of government contracts and working with university to basically keep the company going until the technology was good enough. So now it's a great company. It's really hard to tell. Not a guarantee.
Actually, you just mentioned something that tells us why it is difficult to start a rocket science AI company today. Because if we want to start a rocket science AI company, think of it as a rocket, then the fuel for the rocket is the data, right? And today only the big internet companies have access to huge amounts of data. So how can any AI startup compete if they don't have the same amount of data? It seems like a chicken and egg problem, right? So how do you think, have you seen any success case of a startup? I mean, there have always been startups succeeding, but do you think that they should start with like pure business model, try to get data, and like Didi, you know, these companies then became AI company later, right? Do you think that's a better way than just starting out as an AI company without the data?
Yeah, very good question. I think there are really two ways. One is you build up the data, then and that data is not only sizable, structured, related to a business outcome, but also proprietary.
Right.
And that when you have that, ED has the proprietary transportation data. Meituan has the proprietary food eating data, right? So when you have that, you're in good shape. Then you know a giant company like Tencent and Alibaba, they don't have the transportation data or the takeout eating data.
Mm-hmm.
So you're able to go to a new space and collect the data, make it proprietary. That's one way to have an unfair advantage, and then you build your AI later. That's one way. Another way is you're the AI company. You sell data to companies who have their own data, right? You don't sell the data. You just sell the platform. So suppose you have a AI technology. Let's say for I'll make it up for money laundering, anti-money laundering AI software. Then you go sell it to Bank A, and you help them adopt it, and they pay you an annual subscription. Then you go to Bank B, then you go to Bank C. In each bank, the data is theirs. And Alibaba and Tencent don't have any substantial advantage compared to you because they don't have the internal data that banks do. So building a product and using the client's data would be a second way. And one more comment on the first way is that, sure, Didi, Meituan are companies that really got in, even with giants sitting next to them, Tencent, Alibaba. But there are actually others. Pinduoduo is another one, and Kuaishou are also new ones. So new companies, if they pick a great application, gather the user quickly, and create a proprietary database, they could do things that the giants may be too slow to wake up and realize. Other new apps may come up in the consumer side, but I think on the business side, maybe even more plentiful in terms of opportunities. For example, healthcare is a good one. We have been investing in a number of healthcare companies that are not AI, but they have the data. One is SaaS that's sold to hospitals as hospital information system, so that they could collect patient information. Now, of course, that cannot be shared across hospital, but they could use federated learning to train at each hospital and aggregate into whether it is a smart app for predicting insurance usage or estimating drug efficacy, or maybe a smart diagnostic assistant, or maybe using family history and other elements to do a better radiology. So you could build apps once you have that data. So we go invest in these companies' data. They don't have yet AI, that's okay. We can help them get there with the AI. So that's kind of a new way to invest, and we're kind of hunting for the next Didi or Meituan. You know, Didi, Meituan, and ByteDance, they weren't founded with the belief that their most valuable asset would be data, and that they could AI on top. Their funding was to build a great commerce platform, or that they could build AI on top of that. So we're trying to look for companies that already have sizable databases and that AI could be built on top. So it's definitely possible, two possible ways.
Right. So, about 2 years ago, you wrote about AI superpowers, China versus the US, right? So, I know there are many students who are still curious about that topic. which is that what are the characteristics of Chinese, let's say AI companies? What are the characteristics of these hugely successful Chinese AI companies? Are they different from the American ones? Or can they be replicated in Hong Kong, or what do you think? What are the
so in my book, it was written almost 3 years ago.
Right.
I'm sorry, what are
the main reasons?
You were asking what are
Chinese AI companies?
Yeah, okay. So in my book, I mostly feature consumer AI companies.
Right.
And these are the Meituan, Didi, ByteDance, etc., Xiaomi. And they grew up in a very unique time when they could leverage a virtuous cycle, which begins as follows. First, you have a huge growing population dividend, lots of people getting on the mobile internet, and they become users of products that are funded by VCs. And through more usage, they were able to create better products and attract more users. And the virtuous cycle kept going because China has such a huge population advantage. And this population was jumping on the mobile internet very quickly. So key to their success in building up all this data and then being able to build AI on top of that are several key elements. I think one is the tenacious entrepreneurial environment, that it's gladiatorial competition and fight. And to the extent there's one winner, in China, often there's one big winner, right? Take a look at Meituan versus the equivalent companies in the US, Yelp and Groupon and OpenTable and Grubhub. They're all small companies. In China, one giant one was created. And when you have one giant company, you have all the data. Then you can do a lot better AI than any of these much smaller companies can do. So that, I think, is important. Tenacious entrepreneurs in a winner-take-all gladiatorial environment. Second important thing is that China's population and a large market. And the third important thing is that China has a lot of venture capital funding these companies, as well as very favorable government policies that have helped. That includes things like smart policies at the city level to build infrastructure for smart for autonomous vehicles, as well as building funds to help to attract companies to come to each city to build great products. Yeah. So to wrap up, I think I think the Chinese environment is very unique and conducive to these consumer AI companies. Now, going forward, we're looking at business AI solutions, and we see a number of companies that have emerged from Megvii to SenseTime to other companies, and I think I think their job will have to be AI infusion, and they will have to and largely they're not benefiting from having a huge database, and they're not able to take advantage of having real end user consumer data. So I think these companies will have to follow the way in which huge business software companies succeeded. There will be no exception. The rocket science won't solve the problem for them. So I think for a Megvii or a SenseTime to become an amazing company that's worth $100 billion, they're likely to have to do what Salesforce, Oracle, SAP have done, which is much slower selling to enterprises, listening to the enterprises for problems and pain they have, develop solutions that they could integrate, and think about making money from day one, and expect a much slower curve of adoption rather than consumer. Think about how fast a TikTok or Pinduoduo, they just grew like that exponentially. And when you build an AI company that's selling solutions for banks or retail or manufacturing, then you will not have that luxury. So it will be a different kind of company. It's what has got us here with Meituans and Didis and the Pinduoduos and the ByteDances. Those the playbook for these consumer AI companies will not easily carry over to the business AI, and I think that's going to be remains to be seen. I realize that a number of these AI business companies have already become worth billions of dollars, but their fundamentals are still need to be further improved to be equivalent to a Salesforce or an Oracle. If you think about a Salesforce, you know, they build up their earnings slowly over time,
Right.
and they're not dependent on one customer. They have finally abstracted a true product that could be used in different scenarios. And it's going to be many years for these AI companies to find that way. The same is true in the US, right? A recent company that just went public, Palantir, arguably is one of the first AI companies. But they have not, as far as I can see, built a product suite that is resellable to a lot of people. They're still doing big contracts is a large part of their business. So that becomes quite tough if you have a business-to-business AI company that is doing project after project for customers. That doesn't scale itself to the $100 billion company that I think people all want to do.
So basically you're saying, you know, directly B2C is difficult to build today, and B2B with millions of dollar contracts is also difficult business to build. And then it's interesting you mentioned Salesforce, right? One of the reasons they succeeded was that they have this, internet-based sales service for SMEs, right? You don't pay a lot, you pay a subscription fee, and then it's not like you don't have to pay millions of dollars for this service. So is this the way you think that today's AI companies should go in terms of, their business model? If it's hard to go B2C and to compete against the giants, and it's hard to do this kind of huge contract work, is this the way, it's kind of, I don't know what name it is, for this kind of business model. It's like it's almost like a hybrid of B2C and B2B, right? So it's Salesforce model. What do you call that kind of business model?
Well, it is fundamentally still a B2B model because you're selling to businesses. But if it's built on SaaS and cloud, it's a little easier to do. Then you don't have to install a new server on the premises. That makes it easier. So I think we cannot escape the necessary path. If we want to build a great B2B AI company, you're going to have to figure out you should start with an industry in which you think a pervasive product can be built. Then you work with a couple of big customers that are lighthouse accounts. If it's banking, then work with the biggest bank. If it's sales, work with companies with a large sales force. And you have a few successes, and then you start to abstract part of each implementation so that your next implementation is easier. Mm-hmm. So maybe the first implementation took you 100 engineers, 1 year to build. The next site, maybe it's only 70 engineers and 1 year to build. Eventually you get down to maybe 10 engineers who are consultants, and then your product engineers just refine the product. So that's the path in which Oracle, Microsoft, SAP, and Salesforce have gone. Work with lighthouse accounts, solve their problem, make the next account less heavy than the previous account, and eventually have a product that can be reused with some consultative help on top of that. There's really no substitute than that. It's not as exciting to some people, but that is the way in which AI will be used, one industry after another.
All right, so I'm gonna ask you one last question for our chat, and then we're gonna go to the Q&A session where the audience can ask questions through chat, okay? So my last question will be, since you're at UST again, so regarding pursuing the further research, getting a PhD in AI versus joining industry after your master's or bachelor's, or versus doing your startup right away, what are your recommendations for our graduates, both in computer science, AI, and in other engineering disciplines? What are your recommendations?
I think to each person, okay, I think the answer is different for each person. As I have more experience as a VC funding startups, I begin to see more and more that the qualities of a great entrepreneur are sometimes not necessarily so easily learnable. So if you feel like you have really the risk-taking appetite for starting a company with a high likelihood of failure, and that you truly have the ability to maintain your composure and motivate your team, despite you may be running out of money in the next month, you feel that you could do that, and that kind of pressure excites you and it doesn't scare you away, and that you're willing to fail again and again, that maybe it's your 10th startup that would be successful, and that you're willing to put up with the entrepreneur, then that would be something for you to consider. Maybe to do immediately, maybe to wait a few years by joining a startup first. But I see too many people who think because they read all the great success stories of Mark Zuckerberg and others that they feel the life of an entrepreneur is an enviable lifestyle, but it really isn't. So you got to really make sure you understand that the requirements and difficulties and the risks associated with startup. So that's on that aspect. Whether to do a PhD or not, clearly if you're excited about doing new things, writing papers, and the academic life, or maybe the corporate research, then I think there's no substitute than doing a PhD. I think in doing a PhD, you will certainly learn very deeply about the field that you get into, but you also learn to do independent thinking and research work on your own with some handholding from your advisor. But after that, you can truly take on long-term creative work. And ask yourself if that's something you want to do. And the work in academia can be exciting because you're doing new things. People are learning from you. You're doing things no one has ever done before, if that's something that excites you. But it can also be lonely because you're watching corporate changes and people getting promoted faster, people and then people starting companies and maybe making a lot of money. So those are the trade-offs you have to make, is that this pursuit of new things and pursuit of truth is something that excites you. Then I think PhD is clear. In some cases, doing a PhD and then switching to industry is still possible. But if you're quite sure you don't really want to do, I actually see people who tell me that they want to get a PhD, but they don't want to end up being a professor, write papers, or a researcher. To me, that's largely does not make sense, because if you really want to just go into the industry, going in earlier is better. If I've managed people at Google and Microsoft who are doing product work, so this is not the research team, but the product teams. The people who get a PhD and then go join product team is invariably at a disadvantage. Your starting salary may be higher than that of a master's, but you've lost a valuable 3, 4, or 5 years of opportunity cost that you did a PhD, which doesn't really contribute to your work as an engineer at a great company. So if you just want to work at a great company and have no particular strong interest in pursuing novel ideas and writing papers and research, I think you should just just go directly to industry in that case.
So there is actually a question. The audience, please feel free to ask questions through the Q&A box or chat, it's fine. So there's one question, it's actually an interesting question. It says, Dr. Lee, I see that you have been VP at Apple and Google, also Microsoft, right? How did you rise up the hierarchy, especially without the business education?
Well, actually, it's definitely one step at a time. So when you move up in the corporate world, you cannot make a jump that is too far. For example, I started at the research division of Apple. And then when they were ready to spin out a couple of these research teams to become advanced product team, I jumped at that opportunity. And that was when I went from a manager to a director, and I led that effort. And then when I moved from Apple to SGI, which was my next company, I went from a product person to becoming a general manager. So I took on the responsibilities of marketing and sales of some new products. So it's really one step at a time. And you cannot really expect in one big step, nor would I recommend that you change everything. So think about if you're a rock climber, right? One of the advice that you're given is always keep 3 limbs on the rock, otherwise you'll fall. It's pretty obvious. So if you were in an individual contributor research job and you want to switch over to be a consulting engineer on a business product, that is way too large a shift. You need to shift one step at a time. If your ultimate goal is to be a general manager, then you need to first go from research to product. So 3 of your 4 limbs are still grasping onto the rock because your whole life hasn't been turned upside down, right? You're just switching from researcher to a engineer working on an advanced product. Then you can go to a engineer working on a maybe not necessarily advanced product, any product. Maybe then you can try to become a manager of a engineering team. Maybe then you can try to take over product management in addition to engineering. Maybe after that you can move into general management and take over marketing and sales. So it's always one step at a time, and it's deliberate. And each step can't be that different from your previous step. If you make it too different, you increase the likelihood of failing. And if you make 3 or 4 career moves, you may end up the way I did. And you really can't plan it way ahead of time. Just make sure each career move gives you makes you a little bit closer to a final destination that you want to go, and that you're increasing in your scope and responsibilities, and that it's a move that you can handle, that it still leverages all your strengths and doesn't make you 2 or more limbs off the rock. Then I think one step at a time.
Sounds like a gradient descent algorithm.
That's right. That's right. Everything is gradient descent.
Right. So another question, I guess this is a PhD student from business school at UST. And the student wants to know what are the potential areas that you, Kai-Fu, will feel curious to know from business school people's research on AI. I never.
Oh, would that be?
Yeah. What do they research on AI? Can you elaborate on that question? What do we want business PhD students to research on AI? Actually, I have an answer for that. I would like to see some governance issues, right? AI applications in business, governance, regulation, compliance, and ethical issues, wouldn't you say? Have you seen such work done from business so far? Yeah.
They might be more from government policies, yes. That type of school, like Kennedy School. That
right.
Yeah, business school somewhat, but I also think I think you can study what industries are most ready for AI and what they should do, and what industries, what companies, and what use there might be. because AI is a omni-use technology that could be applied to a lot of industries. But which one's first? How do you measure the size of the opportunity and the potential upside? What industries, what applications? And also I think would be interesting to study corporate culture, because a lot of industries that can benefit from AI, they might be too old school or too traditional. How should they affect change? So if you were running a very traditional bank, how would you embrace AI? Understanding, or actually insurance company, right? Insurance company use actuarial scientists, but might AI replace that? If they do, what happens to all current policies that are underwritten by actuarial scientists? What's the future of insurance? And think about the impact of AI. The impact from a business point of view is one is margin improvement, another is cost reduction. But another aspect that's quite interesting is that it can be targeted, personal, and individualized, right? The reason TikTok is so addictive is that it creates a string that's targeted for just you. The reason that people have spent more and more time on YouTube is they have algorithms that target you. So how might other businesses benefit from that target? And how, for example, what if we have target medicine? So we're not just being prescribed one of 2 or 3 standard treatments, but everybody can be conditionally treated based on all kinds of previous information. And how might that change and disrupt the medical industry? So these are some examples. I'm sure there are many more.
Yeah. Another question, how can emerging business startup penetrate a market in which there's already a major company which even might have a patent in place? Similar idea.
Well, if they have a patent and they're bigger than you, I think you think of another industry.
Yeah.
Because I'm not sure how to do that when you've got 2 giant issues up against you. I think you have to figure out what it is that you bring to the table. Maybe you can solve an auxiliary problem on top of that product or solutions, or find it. It's always a good idea to understand the business user you have and the pain points that they have. By understanding their pain points, you can develop a product to address that pain point. And that pain point, they should have more pain points than whatever is being addressed already by your much bigger competitor with a patent. I think start with that. Don't start with, I want to build something the same as someone else, even though they're bigger and they have a patent. Well, if you start with there, I think it's almost hopeless after that.
So another question is, when you invest in a startup, what is the most important thing you look for? You mentioned different things during our chat, but what is the most important thing you think?
Well, the most important thing is clearly the people, the entrepreneur or the CEO, because the people makes all the difference. And especially at earlier stages, because at a very earlier stage, pre-A or pre-A, they don't have any profits for you to look at. You can't study their revenue and profits, and they probably don't have competition. They may not even have a product. So all you have to look at is the person. And what we found is that really the most amazing entrepreneurs are not your typical standard good managers, so to speak. If you think about the great entrepreneurs of China, right, whether it's Jack Ma or Lei Jun or Zhang Yiming or Wang Xing, they're all unusual. They're not your usual, well-rounded engineering director from a certain company. not your standard, pretty good at everything, well-rounded person who communicates reasonably, leads people reasonably, has interesting ideas. They're usually extremely self-confident, and they're usually different from other people. And some of that difference may scare people away. So it's interesting that really the most successful entrepreneurs have unusual characteristics, and you have to identify them. But obviously, not every investment can lead to such a $100 billion company. So we also look for other attributes of entrepreneurs. We want them to be passionate about the product area they're building. We want them to be very detailed, knowledgeable. We want them to be able to withstand a lot of pressure and take on risk, and has good leadership skills. So even when the company is in trouble, the team will still follow them. So these are what we look for in the person. Other than the person, we also want to look for, are they in an industry that is rapidly growing? We would much prefer to invest in a rapidly growing industry where we would win big if we bet on number one, but we still do okay if we bet on number two or even number three. Because it's much easier when you have a rising industry, because it's basically rising tide lifts all boats, right? Rather than it's a fixed pie and you have to go in and kick someone out or zero sum game. So we want to look for the right industry. And then thirdly, we would look at the product they want to build, whether that product makes sense, addresses true needs, and has a large enough market. So this is for earlier stage. We're also beginning to make some later stage investments, but those are much more basically studying the financials, the numbers, and looking at when they can go public and how many times return. It's more standardized that way.
Thank you. There's another question that I think is very important. We know that different cultures react differently to new products. There can be resistance from people in certain cultures in using AI products because of the concern of data privacy, personal life, and so on. And I would say that's even one of the main reasons that AI products are so pervasive in China, right? People are much more open-minded about using apps with, in exchange for convenience, they don't mind giving personal data. So how is it possible to attract more customers for AI-based products if there's such resistance? Is it hopeless completely, or can we custom users?
Yeah.
Cultures, yeah.
I think for every culture, every substantially different culture, there might be a different way. So, for example, in Europe, right, the approach that's being taken by the European Union is to take GDPR, extend that further, and really work towards a day when data can be given back to the hands of the individual, and then licensed on a per use or per application basis. So to make that, so if you have a population that is really puts privacy ahead of everything else by far and feels is an inalienable right, well, the user is always right. If all your users feel that way, then the opportunity might be to build a new kind of a social network where data is not being shared, or a new search engine where it doesn't use your identity or even your cookie. And maybe it's even encrypted. So probably if I were an entrepreneur in Europe, I would look at things that address the strong desire of the people to protect their privacy against companies and governments. That would be a way to go. It may be trickier. I know that there are some new search engines and social networks being started in Europe that have a different way to think about how data is used. I personally think that makes the problem harder. But if all your people refuse to use Facebook because they think of it as potential compromising the privacy, then that's a business opportunity for people in Europe to have that. I would also say another way is sometimes it's not a question of black and white. Either you have full privacy or no privacy. There are new technologies that potentially can help us have our cake and eat it too. So federated learning is one way to potentially learn on trusted devices. Trusted device could be your own cell phone, so that it transmits back, not your data, but your model. And your data cannot be reverse engineered from the model. So this way, your data never leaves your phone, but AI learns from your behavior. And it doesn't have to be just from your phone. It could be training a AI diagnostic model from 1,000 hospitals. Each of the training is done within the hospital, so patient data is never shared or compromised. And I think there needs to be technology solutions that might be able to overcome these problems. Because if you think about problems imposed by technology, let's take viruses. Back when our PCs were first connected to the internet, lots of viruses came and took over our computer, deleted all the data, did all kinds of nasty things, but we didn't stop connecting PCs to the internet. We also didn't just regulate and put people who create viruses in jail. Those may not be sufficient. What actually happened was very clever people built antivirus software. And that was what protected our PCs, that allowed our PCs and our phones to be connected to the internet all the time, not by using a technology solution to address a technology problem. So I would like to think for each of the concerns people have about AI, whether it's privacy or security, there may be technology solutions that could be applied side by side with regulations that might be able to get people to a point of accepting the protection that the technology provides, while still enabling aggregation of the data and improved AI performance.
There are a couple questions that I think they're related. One, regarding doing a startup in AI. It seems like since you have to invest a lot in an AI company with data and so on, it's difficult to make money for a startup. It seems that most of the time you can aim for exit of being bought out by big companies. Another question is, what happens if you start a company with a great idea and then one of these big companies then copy your idea? I would say just sell to them then. What do you think?
If they have to get copied, sure. Yeah, so I think AI companies today really need to think about making money from day one, because this is selling AI to businesses, not to consumers. So what has got us here won't get us there. So we gotta build up the business competence and capabilities. If you build something, if you have a technology edge, let's say it's one of the rocket science companies, you have a technology edge, and you need to be, well, first you need to be somewhat confident it's not that easy to be copied. And if it is, then you better find ways to build other moats, right? This is described as moats around businesses. That is, I think Warren Buffett came up with the term. If you have a very strong moat, so for example, today, if TikTok no longer, a lot of people tried to copy TikTok, right? We all know that, Facebook and Instagram, and they didn't succeed. And the reason they didn't succeed is there's a moat that already exists. And that moat may be your brand, maybe your user loyalty, maybe that the data is locked in with you, so you can't withdraw easily because you're knowing these people. Or it may be a very strong operations capability that gets the users addicted to using the product. Or it may be a technology that is better than the competition. So you need to build a successful startup, and you need to build your moat somehow. And that moat cannot be forever I'm better in technology, because you as a small company, you don't have the same resources. And we all know that large companies have brilliant AI scientists. So it's quite unlikely your technology edge can be kept for very long. So first, to build a technology company that's immune from copying, you need to keep very quiet. Don't let anybody know what you're doing. whatever you do, keep it very low profile, win a customer in a very far place that no one knows about, and slowly snowball your capabilities. This was incredibly important. When I first joined Google, actually before I joined Google, before they went public actually, they never told anybody about how much money they were making. Because if Microsoft had heard about how much money Google was making from the ads, they could potentially crush Google with a huge amount of investment and other things and buy competition. But so never wake up a giant. So that's really important. Keep very low profile. And also make sure that you're focused on customer needs and that you have some way of building a moat once you're copied. So these are the things you can do to not get hurt by other companies copying you. But ultimately, this can't always work. Sometimes people will copy and startups will die. So we do the best we can to protect it. But there's no guarantee this will always work.
Yeah, and let's not forget that TikTok also succeeded by buying a company called Musical.ly, right?
Yes, that was critical to understand the American customers, right?
Right.
Yeah, and as you said, selling to a large company is perfectly fine. Right. I think when you run a startup, you need to be pragmatic, and whenever you feel selling out is a good return on investment, and fighting it out, you may not win, you should sell. However, I would say when you start the company, never start with the idea that I'm going to build a company and sell it to somebody, because then you don't have the fighting spirit. You're not attracting the best people. So pragmatically sell if you have to, but don't start the company thinking your likely outcome would be to sell it.
Right. There's a particular question on what do you think of AI in Internet of Things and in construction industry, in building information modeling, these two areas, the two separate questions, but they're specific industry specific questions. Do you have any comment, Kai-Fu?
Sure, there's certainly a place for AI in the construction industry. We should, when we think about applying AI, we should not think about, can I take all the construction workers and build a robot to replace them? That isn't how construction industries will use AI. Construction companies can use AI to replicate things. Maybe think about a smart manufacturing, customized manufacturing plant that can make modules that are constructed, maybe one room at a time, and then they're connected at the construction site. So there's a company called CAiRE in the US that has been doing that. And in China, there's a big group called the Broad Group that has also done things like that. So applying AI to build modules of parts of a building or a room, and then they're essentially plugged in together like Legos, that probably is the way to go. Then the automation will happen because you're building, little shower modules and bathroom modules and kitchen modules, and they get plugged together. More and more of that, when they're standardized, the AI and robotics can come into play. See, if every house is a custom house and everything is totally different, it's hard to standardize or automate. But if more and more people use the same, bathroom, shower, or kitchen module, then there's a lot more room for that capability. Now, at the construction site, there are certain tasks that workers do that can be more easily done by AI. For example, laying brick, laying tile are some of the things that work really well. Some other things may be very difficult that may require very fine touch and finish and even artistic touch. So I think there will be a room eventually, I think much of new houses will be built as modules plugged in together by robots at site. And a lot of the connecting, the tiles, the connecting, the bricks can also be done by robots. And the human will be putting the final touch on things that require a high degree of dexterity that only a human can do. Now that's with the ordinary houses. Of course, the high-end luxury, everything will always still be built by people.
Right. So another question for you, how can Chinese AI internet companies expand their overseas business? So far we have seen TikTok, right? ByteDance successfully expanded overseas. What about other Chinese companies? What are your opinions, comments?
Well, my opinion is that the Chinese software capability, Chinese consumer software is every bit as good as American consumer software. That's due to a couple of reasons. One, I think, is the tenacious gladiatorial environment really forces people to be the best they can be. Secondly, is because building software is much more experimental, pivoting, right? Trying something, getting user feedback based on internet, improving. Not so much, come up with a brilliant idea, take 3 years to build it, like the iPhone. So if it were the latter, then the US would have an advantage. But building software is just taking these pieces, testing users, doing A/B tests and improving parts and picking the right solutions. That's very suited to very fast-moving, fast-learning Chinese entrepreneurs. And another huge advantage for China is that China has now developed a large group of product managers. That is people who, at the same time, understand technology, products, market, and users. And this group of people is very rare. Why does India not have its own software industry? Because India is used to doing outsourcing. What does outsourcing mean? It means the products is the management of the thing you're building is managed out of the US, are largely engineers who are remotely managed. So they never got enough of that product management capability. And also they're too far from their customers. Now China is different. These product managers emerge building products for locals and then extrapolate their needs to other markets. So another big advantage for China is that the Chinese economy and demographics and user base is very much similar to that of other developing countries, and perhaps 5 to 10 years ahead. So Chinese youth of 5 years ago may be similar to the Indian or Indonesian youth today, and may be similar to the African youth 5 years from now. So the demographics match. These are young people with a lot of time on their hands, curious, interesting, to learn new things, and don't have a lot of money to spend. They're very different from American, Japanese, or European young people. So as a result, products built in China for young Chinese people will likely work well for other developing countries. So my belief is based on these reasons, there's every reason that consumer Chinese products will become extremely successful in developing countries. Now, TikTok is an unusual exception because they were also successful in developed countries. I think there will be not that many examples like that in the future. TikTok and financial, maybe a few others could be successful in developed countries, but that would be difficult because the demographic match is not there. Furthermore, the current decoupling that US is applying to China, I think will make it difficult for Chinese companies to sell to or to have American users going forward. But I do think going 5 years from now, if we did a poll across the world, Indonesia, South America, India, etc., Middle East, Africa, and say, let's count how many Chinese apps you have on your phone and how many American apps. I believe across the developing countries, there will be more Chinese apps substantially than American apps. In developed countries, it will still be dominated by American apps. So I do see there's a substantial room for Chinese companies to grow. However, I would qualify that by adding mostly to developing countries.
So our time is almost up. I just want to end this with one last question, which I find very appropriate for today's discussion. So this question says that we know that digitization has made our life easier. However, wouldn't that make us lonelier too? Imagine that AI assistants help us a lot, and they also can make us and have less contact with people. And if we do online shopping and, instead of doing shopping in person, then we also will see less of other people. So what if we just, if we're just heading towards a less physical world and a more lonely life? What could we do to avoid that? That's a different question from job replacement, the threat of AI making us more lonely. What do you think?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there are certainly a lot of reasons, as this person mentioned, to be concerned, right? I think more of us are spending more time in front of computers or phones and less so with people. And I think the pandemic makes that worse. And there is definitely a risk that this will keep developing like a vicious cycle. However, there's an optimistic part of me that says, look, if AI and technologies are going to take away the routine work, then what is left for us as humans to do? I think the two biggest things that we can do uniquely that software and AI cannot do, one is creativity, and the other is the human-to-human connection. So if AI truly takes away all the routine, boring, repetitive things and tasks like shopping and doing housework and paperwork and manual labor is all gone, well, what are we going to spend our time on? I would hope that if we believe in the adaptability and in the innate brilliance of humans, that we will find a way for us to shine on the two attributes in which we are uniquely capable. And creativity would mean that more of us would become artists, inventors, scientists. More of us would become artisans and have hobbies and enjoy life. And the other part is that AI can really never replace people in terms of the trust and connection, intimacy that people to people provide. Whether it's in an elderly home, people don't want a robot to help them, all older people take showers, or whether it's people getting more free time on their hands, wanting to spend that time with their families and friends. So we have a lot more time, and one of the things that we uniquely humans can do is reconnecting back to ourselves. So that part of me gives me hope that as routine work become the way, we have more time on our hands. Part of that, connecting and reconnecting to people, especially people that we love.
I love that message. Just like one of your TED Talks, you talk about